Prime Minister Mark Carney is rejecting what the U.S. Treasury Secretary had to say on Fox News last night about a phone call the Prime Minister had with President Donald Trump. Let's compare both takes.
I was in the Oval with the President today. He spoke to Prime Minister Carney.
First off, the President called me yesterday.
Who was very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos.
To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the President, I meant what I said in Davos.
I'm not sure what the Prime Minister was thinking. Of course, Canada depends on the U.S.
I explained to him our arrangement with China. Canada was the first country to understand the change in U.S. trade policy that he had initiated, and we're responding to that.
Okay, we're going to start there with the power panel. Today we've got Emily Nicolas. She is a columnist for Le Devoir. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. And Andrew Thompson is a former NDP cabinet minister in Saskatchewan. It is good to see you all. Andrew, let's start with you. What do you make of these very different versions of the conversation? I mean, I don't know how you aggressively walk back something, but that was a characterization from the Treasury Secretary, flatly rejected from the Prime Minister. How do you view this?
Well, let's start with the most fundamental part. This is obviously a positive development that the President and the Prime Minister have talked, that they have cleared the air, that they have shared their perspectives and their points of view on this. I think from a U.S.-Canada relations standpoint, that's very, very good news. It says that the lines of communications are open and that obviously there were some questions still left outstanding. The rest now, I think, does become one of spin. Obviously, the Americans are, and the President in particular down there, was really taking it on the chin. I mean, American media has not been kind to him after Davos. He obviously came back feeling, if not chastened, certainly humiliated or humbled. And I think that this really did sting him. And so what you're seeing now is an opportunity for them to spin this in a way that looks like Carney is, in fact, accentuating something different of a message than he did in Davos. My guess is what he said was exactly the same thing that every Canadian's been saying along the way. The Americans are our first and our most important market. We remain committed to continental defense and building a stronger continental economy. Can't do that without the U.S., but we need a trusted partner. So in all of that, I think that this was probably a pretty good conversation to have, and maybe does help us get over some of the hurdles and some of the hurt that was standing in the way of a potential trade deal down the road.
Lisa, for what it's worth, we're told the President called the Prime Minister, which is interesting given sort of the public conversations of the past week and the assessments of things. Now, how do you see this? Is this a positive just that they talked, even if the Treasury Secretary seems to think Mark Carney is backing down when there's no obvious evidence that the Prime Minister is?
I think it's always positive, David, when parties are talking. That's what you want to have. You want to have the dialogue. What I don't like about this is the fact that we're getting our news from the United States. We're getting it on a different television program in the United States, if you watch it, and they're getting their first dibs on how to spin it to the Canadian public. I don't think that is proper communication with Canadians. I'm not going to get on my high horse and say that every conversation has to be disclosed. Obviously, there's going to be important discussions. The Prime Minister will have that. He may not want to disclose. But when you're dealing with the United States, especially given this administration, why would you let them define the narrative and then be seen to be saying, well, no, that's not how it went? I think the Prime Minister should recognize, I hope, they're not going to take my advice, but in any event, when you're dealing with the U.S., get your words out first, acknowledge the call happened, put out 2 to 3 lines, whatever you need to put out there. But for goodness sake, don't let the Americans lead the dance on this one, because it looks like we're hiding something and we shouldn't be hiding anything.
Supriya, what are your thoughts on this? We're told that in the 30-minute conversation they discussed trade, obviously, but also Ukraine, Venezuela, Arctic sovereignty, some pretty big issues. No formal readout or notification from the PMO. We found out from Fox News. I mean, what do you make of the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I agree with Lisa here. Like, the reason why PMOs tend to put out readouts for conversations isn't because the people working there just love to put out readouts, right? You're doing it because when you have a readout of a conversation with a world leader, journalists as well as regular folks can then see what the gist of the conversation was. And it might not have prevented Scott Bessent from going on Fox News and claiming that the Prime Minister, walked back his comments. But at the very least, Canadians would not have been informed for the first time that the PM and President Trump spoke because a Trump official told Fox News about it, right? And we would at least have had an idea about what was discussed from our own prime minister. And I think unfortunately, it does make it seem like the prime minister has something to hide here. And while I certainly take him at his word that he did not walk back the comments that he made at Davos, I don't know why you'd want to give the opposition the opportunity to be able to credibly say, look, he says one thing when he knows the camera is on and another when the camera is off.
Right, and look, Emily, this has been a bit of an issue, like the inside baseball nature of the way the press gallery deals with the PMO on proper notification of things. There can be some frustration there, but the fact that we're finding out about a call between the president and the prime minister, it lasted a half an hour, that the president initiated after Davos and the fallout of last week. It is interesting that you had to find out just sort of a throwaway comment kind of on a Fox News interview as opposed to a sort of a formal explanation of things. So where do you think this leaves our understanding of where things are in this moment, Emily?
So I'm going to agree with everyone that the readouts are helpful, and that when Mark Carney has meetings with world leaders, it's good that the public knows about it through very short, succinct, no details necessary spiel on the PMO's website. That's one thing. I do think, even with everything that's been going on with Minnesota and ICE, that in terms of camera on, camera off, we do know that even when the camera is on, the White House lies. So I think we need to get over ourselves about giving credibility to whatever is coming out of the White House when it comes to people the White House sees as adversaries or people that got under their skin. I think it's a good sign that Donald Trump called Mark Carney this week. It meant that if in terms of success by measures of both getting the world's attention and the White House attention and making sure he's perceived as a serious guy, I think that is achieved. And even the fact that they are taking the time to sow discord in Canada, because this is exactly what they're doing, is actually a weird compliment. But the fact that it could sow discourse, that we're like, oh, the White House says something, maybe they have more credibility than the PMO's office. We need to get over ourselves. That's not in 2026. That's not it. But we do need to have some more transparency from the Prime Minister's office. That's great. But there's the separate issue of giving credibility to what the White House says. I'm personally I am over it, and I think a lot of people in Canada are also over it.
I am glad you went there, because it's where I wanted to go. Because look, I think all you have to do is look at the public statements from senior U.S. officials on the events in Minnesota, especially this most recent tragedy, and just, you cannot put them on an equal playing field, right? So, like, and Andrew, there's very little evidence from what we've seen from Mark Carney that aggressive walkbacks are a thing that this particular prime minister does. But there is a segment of the Canadian society out there and the media ecosystem as it exists in 2026 that will amplify these things and weaponize it by saying that, look, you lied. The prime minister lied. This is what the White House is saying. This is what Scott Bessent said. And they're walking back the deal with China. This is the reality, too, that maybe a readout is an outdated thing, but the narrative setting, Andrew, comes in all kinds of ways, and not all of them are good faith actors.
Well, there's no doubt about that. And I think Emily does make a good point that this is a real problem. And obviously, as you're saying, what we're seeing is a lot of this messaging picked up. That's where it becomes problematic in the Canadian political discourse, though, I think. And I saw this certainly play out today. I think we all did, not only as the usual bobbleheads on the online media go off on the right wing, but we had a number of Conservative MPs picking up the American line and parroting it and suggesting that this was in fact the case of what happened. I think that that's a problematic spot. Again, this is a trap. The Conservatives kept stepping into. It's a rake they kept stepping on. That every time the Americans say something, every time Trump's office says something, they seem inclined to not only believe it, but to champion it. And that is, I think ultimately problematic for them, as they are at some point going to have to realize they have to reset with the electorate on this issue and look like they are in fact defending, Canadian values. As was demonstrated by both Lisa and Supriya, there's lots of ways to go at this. to question the Prime Minister's judgment on what happened with that call.
Hmm.
Why wasn't it released? What was the sense of making the comments in Davos the way he did? Why not provide the other standpoint? But instead what we have is the Conservatives in particular defaulting to a MAGA messaging standpoint that I think works against them. And if nothing else, just draws other Canadians around to the defense of the Prime Minister.
Lisa, what are your thoughts on that one? I have seen a few MPs jumping on it and others saying, look, more proof that Mark Carney is lying. I think it was Roman Baber who put that on his socials. What are your thoughts?
Well, I know that people are always going to want to talk about individuals who are making these comments, but it's a hell of a generalization. Those are not any kind of talking points coming from the Conservative Party. I can assure you of that. And it's interesting to me that once again, we're talking about the Conservatives' reaction to something that I believe the Prime Minister fumbled, which is he should have put the readout out before the Americans had a chance to give a narrative on what happened on the call. But it's our fault as Conservatives because somebody said something somewhere in the bowels of the internet. I don't think that's fair, and I think it's taking up too much oxygen. I'm happy that the President and the Prime Minister are talking. I wish they would give better readouts. I wish the Americans didn't exaggerate and lie to the extent that they do, but it doesn't mean the fact that we shouldn't be getting some kind of information or that we blame Conservatives or try to label them MAGA, which quite frankly, I'm sick of as well.
Okay, well, look, this is going to get clipped and I'm going to get attacked for it. But I wasn't suggesting. I was just asking you to respond to what Andrew raised,
No,
right?
you didn't suggest it, David. No, that wasn't you at all.
Okay, I just
that
want
was
to.
not you. I agree.
But Supriya, this is a current that the government has to navigate, right? It's out there that people will side with the White House over their own country in certain moments like this. So how do you navigate that from a communications perspective, right? Like, we don't truly know what's going on in the inside conversations between the President and the Prime Minister, but in terms of sort of like holding national cohesion during this moment, how do you begin to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, you proactively try and be as transparent and open with your communications as possible, right? So that they aren't seen to be on their back foot. I also think, you talked about the inside baseball nature of some of this with the readout stuff and, this PMO not putting out readouts pretty regularly. But this Prime Minister also gets very snippy when he's asked about when the last time he spoke to Trump is. Very recently, he suggested to a reporter that it was a boring question. But when you're not going to be transparent about when you're actually speaking to the president or other world leaders, then, I mean, what should reporters be doing other than to constantly pepper you with those sorts of questions? So I think it's a tight, sort of line to walk, because obviously the Prime Minister did have very strong words at Davos and is talking about pivoting away from the old way of which we used to do things. But he also has to square that by continuing to talk to an administration that the bulk of our trade and, economy is sort of dependent on. And he's going to have to square that circle. And I think he's doing a pretty good job of it so far. But it's moments like this where regular people start to question, well, it's like, well, is he saying what he's actually saying? And I think if the Conservatives were smart, or the NDP or the Bloc Québécois were smart about it, they would keep needling sort of away at that, because there is a consistency to his inconsistency. Like, if you think about what was said during the campaign of the economic and military partnership with the United States is completely over. And then, one of the first bills that they enacted was the Strong Borders Act, which has all sorts of data sharing with U.S. law enforcement. That's kind of bonkers. That's an inconsistency, right? Talking the way he did at Davos, and then again, I'm not saying he did this, but the U.S. categorization of him walking back those comments is an inconsistency. And again, I believe our Prime Minister. I think regular, reasonable Canadians should believe our Prime Minister over, most U.S. administrations, but especially this one. But again, it's a problem of their own making that they're in this situation.
Yeah, I don't know if the Prime Minister said the relationship was completely over. The terms and conditions under which it had existed were over. The relationship just needs to find new ground rules with the United States when it comes to defense, security, and the economy, and that's kind of the process we're going through now, right? And sorry, do you want to jump in on that, Sabrina?
the clip I used in my Toronto Star column, which was fact checked at the time, was that the partnership was over. I mean, maybe he went on to whatever, but you
Yeah.
can't say that the relationship is over and then want to integrate our data with them when it comes to law enforcement.
Right. No, yes. Anyway, I remember when he said that, gave that speech during the campaign. He was talking about by default that a deepening integration would be the default posture of Canada. It was over. That it would be more, case by case. But anyway, we don't want to relitigate the campaign. But I take your point on it. So Emily, just a last word you on this, and we got to take a break. I mean, they do put out, just to close the loop on the readouts, a lot of readouts when they do have these formal, structured, scheduled conversations. This was a call out of the blue from POTUS, it seems. I mean, just your last thoughts on this whole conversation before we take a break.
Well, one of the lines from Carney's speech that I think people will remember is that he said something along around the idea that our economic integration or our integration can become the mean for our subjugation.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the economy, but I think to go back to Lisa's point about the bowels of the internet, I'm very concerned about even the ways in which we do or do not have control over who's going to believe the Prime Minister lied or not. Very much comes from our integration to the bowels of the internet is basically American-controlled social media company that do sway sometimes more in public opinion than certainly traditional Canadian journalists, traditional media, and definitely people do not necessarily see the lines between party officials and influencers on YouTube or whatnot. And I think that is the ways in which Americans are able to sow discord in Canada, and they have done that to be able to influence the political sphere of several countries around the world. It is not something that is that Americans are new at, using their soft culture, their soft power, and now social media to influence the political narrative of a foreign country. But I do think that journalists on the Hill and everybody else who's following that story and stories to come that will be also along that sort need to understand that this is domestic political destabilization tactics that have been used elsewhere. But when the White House lies about a foreign leader and we're out there being divided, asking whether or not that's true, it's a classic playbook, and we need to understand that if we're not, to quote Mark Carney again, if we're not at the table, we're the food. Well, if we're not playing chess, we're the pawns. And that's what I would add to that quote.
Yep, and Scott Bessent musing about the future of Alberta in an interview with a pretty infamous, let's say, right-wing influencer in the U.S.